Good old muddy York is still drying out today. Earlier in the week, much of downtown Toronto took on a lot more water than it could handle.
Record-breaking rainfall on Monday flooded power stations, subway stops and highways, paralyzing the city and leaving some 300,000 people without power, many of whom couldn't switch on a light for almost 2 days.
Our Glenn McGillivray is the managing director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. He's also an expert in disaster planning, and he's standing by in the dry confines of Queen's Park. Glenn, just last month on this show, you all but predicted that Toronto could be brought to its knees by a major rain event. What did you know that we didn't?
It's happened in the past. We've seen it. August 19, 2005, there was a major rainstorm that hit Toronto. That was about $600 million to insurers. It was a bit of a surprise, but we've seen these things historically, and we keep talking about Hurricane Hazel, 1954. So historically, it's been there. I just didn't know it was going to happen within 2 weeks of my saying it.
Should have been placing wagers on this. Now, in hindsight, Glenn, it seems so obvious that city planners dropped the ball, apparently. Why, for instance, would anyone put a hydro transmission station underground?
That's nothing to do with urban planning. That might be the practice of, say, a Toronto Hydro. And I'm sure they're looking at that right now. It's not for me to say how you should put in these types of facilities, but certainly we have some weak spots in Toronto and in probably most major cities in Canada. And I think we often tend to lock the barn door after the horse is bolted.
Right. We always learn something new after disasters like this. Glenn, the power grid appears to be quite fragile because even after power was turned back on in many areas, folks still had to endure rotating blackouts to make sure the system wasn't overloaded. So is the grid here in southern Ontario in need of a major upgrade?
I think there's certain aspects of the grid that needs an upgrade. Toronto Hydro actually has been talking about it for a few years now, that they need money to upgrade the system. It's always this question about how much are people willing to pay for their service and how much government is willing to chip in and that sort of thing. But certainly there are some deep considerations that have to be made over the next little while.
Absolutely. Glenn, do we take this freak storm as proof that climate change is upon us and we need to plan for it? Or was it one of those once in a century or 2 or 3 times in a century events that we'll never see repeated in our lifetimes?
There's 2 parts to that question. Was this a rare event? It certainly was. By our rough back of the envelope calculations, this might be about a 1 in 500 year event or thereabouts. But you can still plan for them. We firmly believe that you can't point to a single event and talk about climate change and blame climate change. But certainly this is consistent with the science of climate change that says we're going to see more of these events in the future.
And Glenn, a lot of people, whenever we hear about disasters elsewhere in the world, a lot of us here in the Golden Horseshoe say, you know what, we really are in an area that doesn't get affected by weather nearly as much as, the tornadoes we see in the Midwest or drought or whatever the case may be. Are we now changing our thinking that we're not exempt from some disasters, especially after what happened the other day, that we really need to believe that anything is possible, and this idea of it being like Halley's Comet once every 86 years, it doesn't wash anymore?
There are always those that are way ahead of the ball, way ahead of the game, and that are thinking about these things and are planning. So that could be a city, a municipality, a provincial government, it could be a corporation, an individual. And our science shows that if you're affected by these events directly, you certainly change your thinking about it. And so there are those people that are pushing ahead with, getting ready for more of these events. And then there are always those that are somewhere in the middle and way behind and everywhere in between. Hopefully that, as these events unfold, more people realize that we are very vulnerable, whether it's the wind, wildfire, water, etc., and take action to mitigate it in the future.
Are there parts of Canada that are better at handling this and preparing for this kind of event? BC comes to mind, that we could look to for inspiration?
Well, I think you can look for inspiration in various things. British Columbia, as you mentioned, learned a lot from the 2003 wildfires, for example, and took a lot of measures to help prevent that from happening in the future. Places like Edmonton and Winnipeg have been hit with heavy rain in the past and have taken measures like mandating backwater valves in all new homes, for example. Quebec learned a lot after the ice storm. For example, they learned that a lot of municipalities didn't have emergency plans in place, and they made it mandatory that emergency plans be made. So again, sometimes it takes that lesson first, that hard hit, before you learn and before you act. And again, there are some that are way ahead of the game on this and some that are way, way behind.
And Glenn, considering the tragedy at Lac Mégantic, do we need to reconsider the placement of transportation routes, rail, air, highways running through cities?
Well, the work that we do is centered on natural catastrophes. So that's for somebody else to ask. But it's all part of the emergency management preparedness discussion, and we have to start thinking about these things, certainly.
Right on. R. Glenn McGillivray is the Managing Director for the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. He's an expert in disaster planning. Any predictions as to when the next heavy rainfall might come, or you'd rather not make those predictions?
I think I'm going to bite my tongue at this point, so thanks a lot.
Good. That means nothing coming in the near future.
He's 1 for 1, though.
Glenn, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.